welcome to the NJC's 10-minute takeaway, where we will try and cram as much information in as we can into a 10-minute workshop. I'm Tom Stenson, audit trainer and head of training for the NJC. And today I'm joined by Leigh Brookes, ADI trainer and fellow governing committee member for the NJC. Thanks for joining us, Leigh.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me on, Tom. Hello to everyone that's listening or watching.
And in today's topic, we will be discussing the importance of watching the learner. And our 10 minutes starts now. What are your thoughts then, Leigh, on watching the learner and the importance of it?
Well, it's quite an interesting question, and I'm very glad that you've asked it. I mean, if we were to look, for example, at the 17 competencies that the DVSA have devised for the standards check and for the part 3, you'll know it's broken down into 3 main sections: lesson planning, risk management, and teaching and learning strategies. Or hopefully, for listening to this, you'll know that. Many of those 17 competencies, as you'll see as we go through this conversation, are, in my view, definitely linked to watching the learner in some way or another. So, I mean, if we are, for example, to look at lesson planning, and the first competency for lesson planning is, did the trainer identify the pupil's learning goals and needs? Now, historically, there's been a sort of view sometimes in the industry that this only took place perhaps at the beginning of a part 3 or at the beginning of a standards check. That's one of the reasons that the test has now changed. But actually, it runs throughout the session. So identifying the pupil's learning goals, or certainly identifying their needs, very much, in my view, relates to watching what they're doing. Because how can we identify those needs if we're not aware of what the pupil's doing? If we're not aware of perhaps the impact of pupils having outside the vehicle, or even the impact on the road users of towards us and our vehicle and the pupil on the lesson. So that would be the very first sort of line on the form. I think is very much related to watching the pupil. If you've not identified those learning needs, then again, we're going to move on to, was the agreed lesson structure appropriate for the pupil's experience and ability? If we're not aware of what the pupil's doing, it's going to be very difficult to say that the lesson structure is appropriate. And then finally, the last section really of lesson planning, was the lesson plan adapted when appropriate to help the pupil work towards their learning goals? But if as instructors we're not aware that the pupil's got a particular issue, like we've not spotted the fact that they're not checking the mirrors before signalling, before they're exiting a roundabout, for example, how are we going to be able to adapt that in the lesson and help the pupil work towards that learning need?
And I think what's nice there as well is that you've highlighted how it links throughout the whole of a lesson, not just a part 3 or a standards check, and how that directly links to risk management. Because we know that the competency was the trainer aware of the surrounding the pupil's actions. But again, from keeping things safe, if I don't know what my pupil's doing or not doing, that makes it far more difficult for me as the trainer to keep things inside and outside the car safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the biggest things that we see, certainly I see when I'm training PDIs, is people are missing faults because they're not watching the pupil perhaps at the right time. And I think, again, for PDIs listening, there is a tendency when you first start to perhaps pay too much attention to outside the vehicle because you're worried about what's going to happen. You're worried about what the pupil's going to do. And also the fact that you spent perhaps, in some cases, many, many years as experienced drivers looking ahead. There is a tendency to put perhaps too much focus outside the vehicle when actually at the key points we should be watching the pupil to identify those issues.
And I know we've spoken about this before, and although on paper it sounds pretty straightforward to just watch the pupil at the correct time, but you trained as an examiner, and I like the way that that when we've spoken before of the process that you were trained to use to watch the learner at that point. Could you just go through that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's right. Back in, well, several years ago now, back in, I think it was about 2018, I went on the examiner's training course at Gardington. And yeah, the technique that the DVSA taught that I was trained in is actually not a million miles away, really, from the technique that many older instructors have used. They might know it as RAMP, which is road ahead, mirror, and then pupil. I was training something very similar, which was mirror, look, talk. So we're checking the same thing, really. We've already scanned the road ahead. We're checking the mirror. Now we're actually looking at the pupil, and then we're giving them the instruction or the direction so that we can watch for pupils' reactions, which are triggered by directions. We're already keyed up. We're looking directly at the pupil. I'm not a fan, and this might be contentious to some people. I'm not a fan of eye mirrors. Even before I'd undergone that training, I didn't use an eye mirror as a trainer. Although that said, I have experimented with one back in the past to see whether it would make any difference. Because again, my view is on driver training. I'm going to go away and I will always look at researching perhaps the best techniques. If somebody comes up with a technique that I've not heard of, well, I'm fully prepared to give that a go
Yeah.
and find out myself whether I think that that is an improvement on what I'm already doing or not. And I think as professionals, that's what we should be looking at with regards to things like CPD. I'm not going to rule out something unless I've had a look at it myself and made my own decision on it. But yeah, but based on that and the later training that I've done, actually personally, I've never used an eye mirror.
Yeah, I mean, again, as a personal view, I'm not keen on them. I do prefer the direct observation. And I think something that we've spoken about before as well, with the direct observation, is people aren't always doing it at the correct time, which you touched on a moment ago. They're often looking out the windscreen while they're talking, and then they turn and look at the pupil. So by that point, they potentially could have already missed the early observations that the pupil's done. And I know sometimes with eye mirrors that might be picked up, but yeah, I'm with you. My preference is direct observations.
And again, there's also elements that we can't see with eye mirrors. I'm going to need to look at the pupil sometimes, even if in my peripheral vision I might be able to pick up their hand movements. I'm
Mm.
still going to need to look at their feet on occasion, especially perhaps in the early stages. So if I'm already looking at them for that, then I might as well be looking at them to see what they're doing with their eyes. It also enables me as well. I think you're going to pick up a bit more on the body language than if you're just staring at a pair of eyes in a mirror as well.
Mm.
And that's again linked back to the national standard. Because when we think about those 17 competencies that I mentioned earlier, those are in essence the sort of highlights or the key points of the national standard. But there's a whole lot of information that sits beneath those, which again for PDIs, people coming up for part 3, or perhaps looking for some standards check training, and go away and have a look at the national standard and have an idea of the information that sits beneath it. Because all of those competencies are linked into different units and elements of the national standard, just they're not spelt out in that way on the form. Again, the ADI1, the examiner's handbook for the part 3 and the standards check, that's another good source of information because that links to positive and negative indicators and also things within the national standard that we've just been talking about, and makes that in a more simplified guide for examiners on what they're looking for or what they're not looking for when they're assessing those lessons.
So we've spoken about sort of the mirror look talk routine, and how that can be used. What about when pupils are perhaps at a junction or are moving off? Is there sort of specific things or tips that you'd offer to try and help not only trainees but instructors improve at watching the pupil?
Yeah, I mean, again, my advice on that would be going back to the sort of training that I've done previously. And these are things you don't always think about. And then when you go through it, you realize actually the reasoning behind it and how it works, and perhaps you weren't doing it yourself in the past, is actually we're shadowing the learner a lot of the time. So that way, we're not giving away any clues. If I start looking around, then there could be a confusion there over did the pupil fully understand how the responsibility of risk would be shared, for example, because they might think, well, I'm not going to look because I've seen the instructor look, so that could be an issue. Or actually, I could be giving a cue away to the pupil.
Yeah.
I could be giving a subtle hint to them. Well, actually, if I start looking, oh, I wasn't going to check the blind spot, but you've just reminded me now because I've seen you check the blind spot. What's sometimes known as the giving of silent instruction or avoiding the giving of silent instruction. So certainly with pupils in the latter stages, I'm going to be shadowing them. I'm going to be avoiding that. Certainly with pupils in the earlier stages, again, we might be splitting that responsibility. We might be saying, okay, we're going to look together, or I'm going to do the observations. So then, of course, it's not relevant. I'm not saying that's always the case. It depends on that discussion, the level that your pupil's at, and how you're splitting those roles and responsibilities.
I think one of the interesting things there as well is sort of what you were saying about the giving of silent instruction. So perhaps prompting our learners without realizing we're prompting them. But again, I bring it back to the risk management side of it as well. I had an example where I had a trainee watching me deliver a lesson, and the learner had come up to the junction and had approached in second gear and was still in second gear. So she was trying to do this on her own. And because we'd already agreed that this is what she would try and do, I knew that I wasn't going to let her pull off at the junction because it just, at that point, the risk management was low. And the trainee said to me after, you seemed so relaxed and so calm and you weren't looking. And so the conversation afterwards, I didn't need to look left and right because I knew that pupil wasn't going to move off at that point. So I've got this sort of domino effect leading up to that junction. Because I'm aware of what's going to happen, I already know potentially what I'm going to allow the pupil to do or not do, and that's my control of, or the risk management side of that.
Yeah, because we've made that assessment. That actually, I'm thinking to myself, well, actually, they're not going to go from here anyway. If they're about to go, I'm going to stop them, either verbally or physically. So there is no point at that point looking. But yeah, so it is, intrinsically, in my view, tied into risk management as well. I'm not saying that it's impossible to pick up faults if you're not looking directly at the pupil. I'm just saying that, in my view, that's the best practice. Some people will have clear head movements, actually, that you can pick up, say, for example, in peripheral vision, or even if you just sit and get a very slight angle. But if you get people that don't, and like everyone listening is probably sort of a variety of pupils, somebody does very little head movement or even just does some eye movements, and you're looking directly at them, you don't necessarily pick that up. So again, I'm watching the pupil in the early stages, and I will pick up cues. So as I've said, some people, they will have a more definitive head movement, which means I've got to concentrate quite as much watching them. And that same thing ties in as well, is that if the pupils, as I'm looking at the pupil, I'm looking for a mirror check. Well, once they've done something that would require a mirror check, i.e. signalling or slowing down, and they haven't done one, I don't need to keep watching them for that mirror check because I've got the fold. And I think that confuses perhaps some certainly trainees who I think I've got to keep watching the pupil, or what happens when I'm watching the pupil. Well, actually, it's only for really a very short section of time. And we've already assessed it safe because we're watching what's happening in front and we're watching what's happening behind. And if it was high risk, the sort of opposite of the situation that you've described there, Tom, then actually, yeah, I might not be looking directly at the pupil. I might be scanning the head or switching my attention between them and the developing hazard in front. Because ultimately, if the pupil doesn't check the mirrors, for us as instructors, it's low risk because should already be aware of what's happening.
Yeah.
I can always ask the pupil afterwards, I wasn't watching you then, Fred, because I could see that child was about to run out in front of the road, but tell me about your mirror checks, for example. So it's not the case that we're constantly having to watch them, 90% of the time. It's, as you mentioned earlier, it's in the timing.
Brilliant. Well, we are at the end of our 10 minutes, I'm afraid. So thank you very much for joining us. And yes, thanks again.
No problem. Thank you very much. Look forward to speaking to you all soon.